right, we are ready to get started. So happy Friday, everyone. You made it through the first week, or at least you're almost there. I don't know how many classes you have after this, but we're going to wrap up with Chapter 1 today. So we had finished off talking a little bit about how psychology was spreading, and specifically spreading into North America. And then we started touching very briefly on how psychology comes into Canada. So we mentioned that first psychology laboratory in Toronto that was established by James Mark Baldwin. And so Baldwin also helped found the American Psychological Association, and then not too long after, not too long after, we had the Canadian Psychological Association founded. And I kind of mentioned that you really don't hear too much about the Canadian Psychological Association. The American Association is much larger, and you'll know it as APA formatting, and they're the ones who give us guidelines on how to organize our references and how to write our papers and things like that. The Canadian Psychological Association will have its own jurisdiction with Canada, and we work with them, but don't necessarily think to name them all the time. We had also dropped a couple of big names that are going to come back throughout this course. One of those being Brenda Milner, who was, she's actually most well known for working with HM. So if you've heard of HM and that specific case study, you might already know a little bit about her. And if not, we'll come back to that in the chapter on memory, because she studied basically someone who lost their ability to make long-term memories, but could still form sort of procedural memories. They could learn to do things, but didn't remember learning to do them, which is really cool, and we'll spend quite a bit of time with that later. And then Donald Hebb was another Canadian who we'll talk about when we start looking at neural pathways, because a lot of his theories really helped shape this idea that cognition and thinking things and doing things repeatedly could lead to the development of these stronger associations in the brain. So again, they're interesting people, and we'll come back to them as we move through their topics. But for our new topics, we're going to continue on and talk just a little bit about culture and diversity in psychology. And I've already been alluding to this a little bit throughout our lectures, with the mention that psychology is fairly Western-focused. In North America, we focus on North America. Sometimes we'll also bring in things from Europe, but for the most part, we stay pretty focused on our own researchers, our own labs, that sort of thing. But if we start looking at some of the terms here, we have this idea of ethnocentrism, which is viewing one's own group as the standard for judging. And that's a pretty good definition for what's happened, at least historically, within psychology, where you are studying psychology in North America, so you focus on North America, and that is then your standard to compare everything else to. And so, again, historically, we've seen a lot of middle and upper class white males studying middle and upper class white males, usually through universities. So a lot of universities will have their undergraduate students act as participants in studies. So university graduates are studying university students and making claims that they're trying to generalize to the population as a whole, but you can imagine that causes some problems. So as we went along in time into the 1980s, we started seeing a little bit more interest in how different cultural factors might influence behavior. Maybe just looking at the people who are exactly like us is not the best way to get a good feel for humanity as a whole. So we started to actually intentionally bring in diversity into psychology. And this has had massive improvements in later years. So we're starting to get away from just studying middle and upper class white males, and we're starting to study sort of everyone that we can. This is still biased, and I still mention it because a lot of studies, specifically on university students, are still only looking at the people who are attending universities in that particular location. So we have some limitations based on our populations, based on our samples. And we'll talk about that in chapter 2 as to where we draw our samples from to do research. But we have to keep in mind the limitations of our sample when we consider what we can sort of more broadly apply our ideas to. And in more recent years, as we've seen more sort of independence and communication between different parts of the world, it's becoming easier and easier to actually have more of a diverse sample population for your studies. So instead of just doing in-person studies, there are surveys online now. There are collaborations between universities. The lab that I've worked with, when they do research with humans to compare to our chickadees' learning abilities, we'll do our own experiments with our own undergraduates, but to try and increase our ability to apply what we've learned, we'll partner with other universities around the world. So we have people in, I'm drawing a blank, somewhere in Germany, to try and get another population of interest. And they're trying to find more and more people further and further abroad to be able to expand what we can apply our findings to. So it's always a good idea to keep in mind what the research has been done on, who they've been looking at, because that will affect who they can make claims about. We should also mention the point of intersectionality and how sort of the overlap between things like culture and location, Canada, sort of like Canadians and Americans and whoever else you want to look at. There's this overlap between different groups, different experiences, different heritages that will influence behavior dramatically. So instead of just looking at, say, university students as university students, it might matter what country they're in, what country they're originally from, what their previous experiences are, and so on. So even within a particular group, however you define your group, there can be issues or other things to consider that can influence your results. And so that's what intersectionality means for us, is that we have to consider sort of as many different factors as we can so that we don't make erroneous conclusions. And it's good to keep in mind that multiple people can belong to multiple different cultures, multiple different groups at the same time. So even if we're looking at university students at Concordia, that's not all that individuals are. They can belong to other groups depending on what they identify with. So as we move along, we're starting to do better at keeping these things in mind to include that kind of diversity and consideration, but it's still not ideal. Thank you. Much appreciated. Thank you. All right. So for our moving into the end of this chapter, I just want to talk a little bit more broadly about how psychology exists as a whole, and then we'll have some bigger conclusions at the end. So this is more of a for your information. I'm not going to test you on what pieces make up psychology as a field. I just find it interesting because, as we said at the very beginning, everybody has their own preconceived notions of what it means to be a psychologist. And there are different areas and different fields that you can go into, and this just gives you an idea of how it's broken down right now. Now, this is always in flux. There's a lot of movement and change here, but for the most part, we see a lot of people who are involved in developmental and social psychology. So looking at how we change and how our behavior evolves over time as we get older. Social psychology, focusing on how we interact with each other. We have a big portion in educational. So how do schools work? That's a major part of people's lives, and what psychological factors relevant to learning and education and schools apply in this situation. We have health, pretty self-explanatory. Behavioral neuroscience, so we mentioned looking at how behavior and our brain work together. Experimental psychology would be where I kind of fall into that category, I guess, doing experiments, operant conditioning, research, collecting data, that sort of thing, as well as cognitive when you focus specifically on how the mind is working. So there's lots and lots of different areas of psychology, but they all fall under that broad umbrella of psychology. And if we want to look at sort of, once you're into more contemporary psychology, what are our principal professions? So clinical psychology is the biggest of these. Clinical psychology makes up a large portion. We also have counseling psychology, so instead of being a clinical psychologist, maybe you work one-on-one to guide people through situations. Maybe you work as a guidance counselor. That would fall under that category. School, I guess, also gets its own special little sliver because schools are so prominent in our society. And industrial organizational psychology is an interesting one. And I've realized that these are the people who will go into, say, businesses and find the best way for a place to work. So how do we minimize interpersonal conflict? How do we maximize productivity? How do we make the environment better for everyone? And so on and so forth. All right, so just a little bit of an overview there, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about the perspective that we've mentioned. We've talked about different ideas and schools of thought and different approaches to psychology. And so I've mentioned that we moved from behavioral into cognitive, and there's something in the middle with cognitive behavioral stuff. We have our humanistic and our positive psychology. We have all of these different areas. And a lot of people want to know, out of all of those options, which one is the right answer? What is the right thing to do? And the answer actually is that there isn't a right answer. You should get the idea by now that each perspective offers a unique viewpoint, a unique approach, a neat way of studying a particular topic. And some of these perspectives work better than others in different areas. So if you want to study how chickadees form concepts, you really don't necessarily want to go with a pure or a radical behaviorist approach because concepts don't work from that viewpoint. But that being said, you can have multiple different perspectives approaching the same problem, and they can come up with sort of more and different answers. So having different perspectives, people with different areas of expertise can be very important. So there isn't any one correct field. Some just make more sense than others in certain situations. And sometimes it's really nice to have somebody else come in and give you a different viewpoint because you might not have thought of that. So these perspectives are not necessarily mutually exclusive. As I said, they can overlap and combine and come together. And that gives you that overall idea that psychology is broad, complex, and works in sort of at multiple levels. Before we get into our chapter on methodology and how we do research, I'd like to point out a couple of challenges in psychology that you should keep in mind as we work through the coming chapters. The first of these challenges is that behavior is really hard to predict. Even if you do the best job documenting things and setting up your experimental situation or anything like that, people and other animals are going to do unpredictable things. So you might think that you've accounted for all possible outcomes, and you will almost always be unpleasantly surprised. Sometimes it is a pleasant surprise. Sometimes you find stuff you didn't expect at all. But we have to keep in mind that it's going to be pretty versatile, is what we'll say. We also want to keep in mind that psychological influences are rarely independent of one another. And what that means is that things very rarely happen in isolation. So just as I was talking about intersectionality, and we have to consider all of the different groups that an individual might identify with, the same with our psychological issues. Maybe we're trying to account for something as simple as noise, but we didn't take into account humidity. That could have a massive influence, and different factors that are influencing a particular behavior can interact, which makes things even more complicated, which is just what you want as a research scientist. We also want to keep in mind that people are unique, and we have lots of individual differences. So it's not just cultural differences, it's not just locational differences. Each individual person has had different personal experiences, and their past experiences will change how they react in the present. That kind of ties us back to the fact that behavior is really hard to predict. So we can't know every little piece of somebody's back history. And so we can't exactly predict how they're going to behave in the future because we don't know everything about previous experience. We also have this problematic thing where people influence one another. When you're trying to do psychological research, people will change the way that they act based on who else is present. And again, we'll talk about that in chapter 2, but it's really problematic, especially when your researchers are people. So if you're sitting in a room with someone and you're asking them questions, the fact that you are asking them questions changes their response. And so we have to keep that in mind when we're looking at our collected data, because people will do things like answer in a way that makes them look better, or they might lie about some factor that might make them look bad. Or maybe people are going to give you the answer that they think you're looking for because they want to be helpful with your research. And of course, by changing what the true response is, you're not actually giving them accurate data, which is really problematic. And again, behavior is often shaped by culture. So instead of just individual experiences, these experiences of groups as a whole. So there are so many factors going on in the background, so many moving parts. And this is why it's really difficult to try and study humans. Some of these factors will work for other animals. We do have to consider things like individual differences when we work with chickadees, but it is sort of so much worse when you work with humans who have a lot more complex thought processes that we have to try and account for. So these are some ideas that I just want you to keep in the back of your mind, things to think critically about as we move forward, and especially as we start talking about say designing studies or critically evaluating studies that have been done based on maybe their methods, the people they're studying, or the conclusions they're trying to draw from their results. All right, and so for our last slide for this chapter, we're going to focus on some of our major themes in psychology. And these are going to be kind of a sum of things that we've already talked about, things we've gone over so far, and again, things that you're going to see repeated over and over as we go through this course. So we start off at the very beginning with the idea that psychology is empirical. The whole thing I was trying to get across with our history of psychology was that we're pushing really hard to get a scientific field. It wanted to be a standalone field that did science things in an empirical way. So they collected data, or they're striving to collect data using a predictable system. They're trying to evaluate that data in a predictable fashion. That's where we're going to bring in statistics very briefly, though I don't get you to calculate any. And just sort of thinking about things critically that way. So above all, psychology is a science, and it should be approached that way as much as possible. Psychology is also theoretically diverse. With all of those different perspectives that I've talked about throughout the last few lectures, there are lots of different perspectives, lots of different possible explanations, even different explanations for the same thing. And so when we start getting into some of our concepts, things like sensation and perception, even something as simple as how our eyes perceive light, we can see different theories from different schools of thought. And we might not even know what the correct answer is because both sides have good points. So you'll find that instead of what you've come to expect from high school, where there's a right and a wrong answer, we start seeing more and more that there's sort of a gray area in between where we're not quite sure, or we'll find a way to mix in two different ideas or more, depending on the complexity of the situation, which is pretty cool. We also want to keep in mind that psychology evolves from a socio-historical context. And what that means is that all of these different parts of psychology came about for a reason. So I mentioned our rise of cognitive psychology coming out of World War II and wanting to design instruments that were intuitive to look at. That's coming out of a socio-historical context. So where things have come from, what situations precipitated the existence of these different ideas, that's important and can really affect the direction of a field at the time. It's also good to keep in mind when we look at things like controversial perspectives, some of the weird stuff that Freud was proposing. It makes sense given the time and the place it was proposed, even if nowadays it's less commonly accepted. So we keep in mind not just the theory itself, but what led to that theory and why it sort of makes sense in the context. We already stated that our behavior is going to be driven by multiple things. There are multiple causes, and that's why it's really hard to predict behavior. We have previous experience, current environments, internal processes, all sorts of different things can work together and interact and influence our behavior. So we have to consider not just what we immediately assume to be driving behavior, but we also have to start thinking critically about what else might be going on. We mentioned that behavior is shaped by cultural heritage. So what we do isn't just determined by our own individual experiences, but what we've learned from those around us. So as a child, you maybe didn't think that getting into an elevator, there's a right way to stand. You might just get into an elevator. But very quickly, by observing those around you, you learn that it's weird to stand backwards in an elevator. You should always face the door when you're in the elevator. So that's something that you've learned by observing those around you. And we do that with all sorts of things in our lives. So we need to keep those influences in mind. Down at number 6, we can talk about behavior being influenced by both heredity and environment. So we'll talk more about that in upcoming chapters. But this is basically saying that we have an interaction of our genetic material, our biology, the stuff we've inherited from our parents, as well as things that we learn from our environment. So there are some external influences and there are some internal influences, and there's usually an interaction between the two, and we need to keep both of those in mind. And that'll become important later because there are some misconceptions about the fact that maybe people are entirely controlled by their genes. Maybe there's a gene for aggression and you assume that everyone with that gene is aggressive, which is actually a thing we'll talk about. But we have to keep in mind that environmental influences, the way people are raised, the environment that they're in, can dramatically influence the interpretation of our genes. And it's not as deterministic as we might think. And we also want to keep in mind when it comes to people's experience of the world is highly subjective. As I said, each individual has their own previous experiences, and what you've experienced in the past influences how you interpret the future or the present. So every individual is going to have a different interpretation of a situation, and as psychologists trying to study how we're interacting with our world, we need to keep that in mind, that not everybody is experiencing things the same way. And so all of that tells us that this is a lot more of a complex concept, and there's lots of things to consider and lots of moving parts that we're going to want to keep in the back of our minds as we move forward. And that is what I have for today's class. So I'm going to be releasing you fairly early on a Friday. I will be saying just a couple of quick announcements. Monday is a holiday, yet again. Don't come in on Monday. I've repeated it to myself every day. So we're going to pick up on Wednesday. You should be able to find our chapter quiz for chapter 1. You should have access to that on Google now. You can take a look at that. There's no time limit on it, so you can log in, look at it, log back out. Whenever you submit them. Oh, if you click back in on it after submitting, it should show you the marks.
Okay, I'll try.
Okay, and if you don't, send me a screenshot of what you do see, and I'll troubleshoot. Okay. Yep. I'll probably go up this weekend. Yeah.
We can just do that, like, whenever.
Yeah. So the chapter quiz, you want to do it sometime before the first midterm, but you can submit it on the
I only have 2 classes today.
What's the difference?
There's just yeah, so the U of A is weird in that they have sort of the science side of things where you focus on like neuroscience and learning and like what people would call the hard sciences, and then the art side of thing, which is more like developmental and social and cultural psychology. In practice, there's not really a big difference. It's all about like which faculty the programs are run under. Yeah.
That's like the same thing.
Yeah. So it's annoying because I've worked with the Department of Psychology at the U of A, and there is 2 different faculties that we have to report to. You have to send them all the stuff. Some of the classes are arts classes, some of the classes are science classes. So you need more science psychology classes if you're getting the Bachelor of Science, and you need more of the arts psychology classes if you're getting the Bachelor of Arts. But a lot of the like core stuff is like interchangeable.
Oh.
Yeah, and so you'll even notice, like my supervisor, he has a Master of Arts because at the university he was at, that's what psychology was classified as. But some universities it's a science, and the U of A just didn't pick, so it's both.
Okay.
Yep. No problem.
Is there a chapter 1 quiz just for practice, or is it for actual marks?
It's for actual marks, so our chapter quizzes end up being, I believe it's 10%. Double check in the syllabus because I'm really bad with numbers, but it lists sort of what they're worth, and there's going to be 1 per chapter, so they end up being worth like 1.2% or something total.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. I'm not sure.
You can go first.
Okay.
So basically, I'm wondering, so obviously, we're looking at the psychology is not, I don't know if it's not just accurate, but I'm wondering, just through your pockets, can someone go over those to study to use for, let's say, when the midterm comes up, do you think that's enough?
Yeah, so if you're the kind of person that can learn really well from the way that I present, then yeah, you can probably use one like that. Some people, maybe the way that I present it, they leave them with questions. So that's when the textbook's really useful. But it's not, the way that I describe it is I use the textbook to make my slides, and I use the textbook to make my exam questions. But for both, I pick which topics I think are most important and most critical, and I use those. And because I'm picking the most important, I tend to pick the same topics for both.
So you'll kind of give us a rundown of which ones to look at specifically?
Yeah, and even like you've kind of seen it already when I'm teaching a lecture, I'll say like, oh, this is a fantastic type of question.
Yeah.
And when I do that, it's because I know that every year I use a question like that. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. All right, who's next? Okay.
There's one question.
Okay. Okay.
I just roam here and there, and my I feel that the psychologist is
No worries. I record all of my lectures for this class, so you haven't missed out on anything. You can actually sit down and listen to all of the lectures I've done so far. And the way that I do it is there are no hard due dates in this class until the end of September. So there's nothing due until our first midterm on September 27th. So you have lots of time to get stuff sorted. I know that there's a lot of people moving in and out of classes, and that's how I record stuff. So I can pull it up right now, and I can show you our E-class.